DaVo here from the Axiom Body Piercing Studio in Des Moines, Iowa. And coming up next, Body Piercing Basics number 5. Going on to more terms and vocabulary. Going to cover piercing procedures and techniques today, so stick around. Welcome to Body Piercing Basics number 5. This is our 5th one covering, so I'm going to kind of talk about the terms and what some of those mean and getting you kind of a basic understanding so that you can have that educated discussion with your piercer when you go in and can ask him some questions that maybe you're curious about. This one, we're going to cover some of the common procedures and the tools that are used for that. We've talked about the tools, but let's talk about how those tools are used. First one, clamping. Clamping is where you use a set of forceps to flatten out the tissue and keep it straight and secure during the piercing process. Most common ones that are used are Pennington or Bollinger forceps. It's used to not only avoid the possibility of the tissue rolling or moving while that piercing is being done, but it also can flatten out the tissue, which gives the needle a shorter distance to travel, kind of compacts the area, and can make the piercing less painful. The other thing is it allows you to, if it's a situation where you're doing a piercing where it's very important that both sides of that are straight, to line that up and give you a guide when doing the piercing. A lot of piercings are done with this. By clamping, tongue piercings, lip piercings, labret piercings, a few ear piercings like trachea. I do with forceps every time, just basically to avoid that tissue from rolling off to one side or the other and making the piercing crooked. Nipple piercings, of course, navel piercings, various different genital piercings are done with clamps. Other piercings are done one of two other ways. Either freehand, which is where basically the needle is lined up with the area, the back is supported. I'm old school, I still like to use corks. And then the needle is injected in through the tissue and then into whatever is on the other side. Freehand piercings are very helpful in areas of the body where we do not want to distort the shape of that particular part of the anatomy and cause the piercing to be off-center or crooked. This is commonly used with ear piercings a lot of different ear piercings. I'll do freehand, including Dave piercings, rooks, sometimes antitrachesis, industrial piercings. Also, I do nostrils that way. Most of the piercings that I do below the belt and actually below the neck, I prefer to clamp. Next method is needle receiving tubes, and a lot of times needle receiving tubes are used in various different ways. A needle receiving tube is a piece of metal tubing that is hollow. One side is usually cut off at an angle. It can be used to support the back area of the piercing, and then the needle is injected in through the tissue and then into the needle receiving tube. It makes it very easy or very helpful in areas of the body where it's very tight and there's not a lot of room to work with to avoid contact with other parts of the body, or needle strikes for that matter. It was really designed for Prince Albert piercings to be inserted in the urethra and then the needle injected into it instead of trying to figure out how to route a needle through a person's urethra, which I'm sure you can assume is not going to be easy. It has expanded use and it's used for a lot of different things. Sometimes I'll use it with nostril piercings. I use them with septum piercings. I use them with clitoral hood piercings. Anywhere where I feel like I am not going to be able to put anything on the back to support it, needle receiving tube is my go-to. The other thing I use it for is to guide jewelry or needles out of the area without doing damage to anything that's around it. For example, when I do a tracheus piercings, I'm injecting in this way, so into the ear. And if I don't have something to guide that needle, it could do damage to that area around the entrance of the ear canal, also into the conch area and everything, causing slight scratches or whatever. So I will use a needle receiving tube to guide the needle out of the way to make sure that I don't do any damage to any other part of the area. Or the other possibility is it can eliminate the possibility of me poking myself and creating a needle strike and then contaminating that wound. and possibly catching something from my clients. So it's a safety issue too. Tapering in guide pins. Taper pins are a piece of wire. One side is thinner than the other side. Taper pins are used for a lot of different piercings during the piercing procedure, and they're also used for stretching piercings, which I'll get to next. Taper pins usually are used in situations where there is a high likelihood that you're not going to be able to get the jewelry in without it. For example, if you're piercing a piece of tissue, and you're piercing it this way, because that's the only way you're going to be able to get the piercing done, and then you're wanting to inject the jewelry this way, like for example, if you're using a labret stud, which has that flat back on the back, how you would do it is you pierce it like you normally would, then you take a taper pin, insert it into the needle to push the needle out, then you take the jewelry, hook it on, or hook it into the jewelry itself, and then push the jewelry back through, and then tighten on the ball or put in the threadless jewelry. This is mainly used with internally threaded jewelry, where the actual post section is somewhat hollow or been hollowed out or tapped at the end, so that the needle can sit, or so that taper pin can sit inside there. It's also used in situations where you're prone to lose the jewelry during the transfer from having the needle in there to putting the jewelry in. Tight areas are areas where there's a lot of flex back and forth. It's helpful to have a taper pin or a guide pin, which is slightly different. Usually it's kind of tapered a little bit, then has kind of an indentation to a thinner piece of wire on the bottom that slips into that internally threaded jewelry. It's very helpful whenever using internally threaded or threadless jewelry, mainly from the standpoint of, unlike rings where you have that kind of rounded edge and can sit in a little bit into that tube shaped back of the needle, with those you can just hook it on and not have to worry about losing that jewelry during the transfer and possibly having to try to line up those holes again or redoing the piercing if you can't get them to line up again. So that's what tapering is, or use of guide pins. Stretching. Stretching is a procedure where you are increasing the size of the piercing itself. Usually done over a long period of time. You can use taper pins, and that's what they were originally designed for, to insert larger jewelry a little bit quicker, but ideally when you're stretching a piercing, you should wait a long period of time between each stretch so that the jewelry just easily glides in. And you usually go from a thinner gauge, slowly building the thickness of the jewelry until you get to your desired thickness. Some piercings kind of stretch on their own just because of the type of tissue it is and because of where it's located at and the weight of the jewelry. I'm going to do a whole video on just stretching in the future, so look for that coming up. Dermal punches and O needles. The biggest difference between what we normally do with a piercing needle and what is in essence done with a dermal punch or a O-ring is we have a lance needle, which most body piercing needles are, that makes a crescent moon incision through the tissue, and then the jewelry is fitted into that. With dermals, you have kind of a barrel cutting mechanism that is super sharp, and it basically goes through and it cuts a perfect circle through the tissue. Problems, advantages, disadvantages. The advantage to it is through cartilage piercing, it can make for a sometimes more comfortable piercing, especially through areas that are prone to problems, because it allows a little extra room for that tissue to grow around the jewelry between that cartilage and the jewelry. Also, you can get extremely large, perfectly circled holes and not have to go through the process of stretching the piercing, and be patient. So, disadvantage of it is that tissue generally will not grow back together. You have permanently removed a part of your body. So if you're doing a large, let's say you're doing a conch, you want to have it, 4 gauge, you are taking out all of that tissue, and if you want it replaced, it's going to have to be done surgically. It won't grow back together. So always keep that in mind, that it is a permanent situation and that it's something that you should consider before getting it done. Microdermal in pocketing. Most people don't understand this. I don't do microdermals because I don't think it's piercing, in my opinion. It is something completely different. It's implants. It is not something that I'm willing to get into. I know how to do it. I've seen it done. I'm more than capable of probably doing it. But I think it's important that I don't think a lot of people go through what the process is. Basically, the first thing you do is you take a dermal punch and you inject it into the tissue and you cut out a perfect circle or perfect circular hole. Then you take a tool and break loose all the tissue in that dermal layer so that it's loose. Then you take a oval shaped piece of metal, very thin, called a foot or back or whatever you want to call it. Insert that in and then tighten on the jewelry with the post excluding. Pocketing is what takes place in the healing process. And what happens is that tissue starts to grow around that foot, creating a pocket. The biggest difference between a normal piercing and pocketing or dermal implants or microdermals is that with a piercing you have one side here, one side here. The piercing hole goes straight through and it grows that tunnel of tissue around the jewelry. So migration and rejection is dictated by how deep it is and how secure or thick or durable that tissue is on the other side of the outside of the body and where that piercing is located at. With pocketing, basically what you're doing is you're trying to trick your body into growing this tissue around it. Once it sees any trauma in one way or another, they can then migrate and reject because your body's going to force it out the same way it would a splinter. So consider that before you do that, especially facial dermals and places in the body that are very visible. It will leave scarring regardless, but I will probably do a whole video just ranting about that. So that's it on piercing procedures and techniques. Hope you learned something. If you have a question or you feel like I missed something, please make a comment below. I love to answer questions. And if you got something to teach me, I'm there. I want to hear it. I want to learn it. Please like the video and subscribe. We do post videos here on a regular basis on body piercing and tattooing. So if you're interested in those two things, this is a place where you need to be. Hit that notification bell so you get notifications on a regular basis. Until then, I hope to see you for your piercing needs in the future.